long after the Fourth Great Ninja War had ended, as the nations rebuilt and the shinobi world moved forward. A single root deep beneath the surface still pulsed with ancient life. The battles had been fought. Madara had fallen. Kaguya had been sealed. And Black Zetsu, the manipulative shadow who had guided events for a millennium, was cast aside, crushed beneath the moon's surface, silenced in a prison of dust and rock. Or so it was believed. But what if he hadn't died? What if the black ichor that was Zetsu's essence, so ancient, so deeply connected to the very chakra of the earth, had simply withdrawn? What if he had feigned defeat, waiting quietly in the stillness of the moon, clinging to the cracks of Kaguya's remnants and drawing from that subtle, lingering energy? What if, over the course of years, he began to shift, regrow, reawaken? It started slowly, small flickers of thought returning to the void. The moon was cold and hollow, but chakra still flowed, however faint. Zetsu's consciousness, fragmented though it was, began stitching itself back together. He did not feel rage. He was past that. Rage was for mortals. What he felt was inevitability. The world would always drift toward conflict, always forget the lessons it had learned. Time, for Zetsu, was an ally, and time, on the moon, passed silently. Back on Earth, peace had taken root. Naruto and Sasuke, now legends, had helped stabilize the world. The new generation of shinobi, born without the trauma of war, were learning jutsu with joy in their hearts instead of fear. Hidden leaf, hidden sand, hidden mist, all were thriving. But beneath their very feet, a familiar current began to stir. Zetsu, still clinging to fragments of Kaguya's power, began to reach out, not physically, but spiritually. Through subtle ripples in the chakra network, he brushed against the surface of dreams. A wandering monk in the land of rivers dreamed of a black tree. A child in the land of earth whispered in her sleep about eyes that watched from beneath the soil. Zetsu had always known how to manipulate stories, how to plant seeds that bloomed decades later. He did not need an army. He needed belief. And so, he began again. The first soul to truly feel him was a young orphan named Karasu from a small border village forgotten by the major nations. She had always been different, quiet, watchful, drawn to shadows. When she meditated, her mind slipped into strange places. And one day, in the deepest part of her mind, she met him. A voice without shape, a warmth that was cold. He called himself a guardian of ancient truths, a spirit bound by betrayal. And Karasu, already feeling abandoned by the world, listened. Zetsu whispered the old tales, the truth about chakra, the story of Kaguya, the treachery of Hagoromo, and the hypocrisy of the shinobi. He painted a new world, one where pain would be removed, where purpose was shared, where the illusion of freedom was replaced by perfect unity. Karasu, still a child, believed, and so a bond formed. Karasu wandered for years, learning, training, and gathering others who had heard Zetsu's voice. Some dismissed it as madness, but others, those who had lost, who had suffered, who could no longer trust the world, those few listened. They called themselves the rooted. They believed the world's peace was shallow, a mask, that beneath it the old rot remained. As Karasu matured, Zetsu grew stronger. With each believer, his spiritual form gained clarity. He was no longer just a whisper, but a presence. The rooted created rituals, meditations that aligned their chakra with Zetsu's flow. In time, Karasu developed a technique that allowed her to partially merge with shadows, a skill eerily similar to Zetsu's own body-slipping abilities. It was no coincidence. He was reshaping her, molding her to be a vessel. But he was careful. The last time, he had acted too boldly. His manipulation of Madara, his reliance on Kaguya's direct return. Now, he would not force fate. He would guide it. Elsewhere, Naruto, now a Hokage and father, began to sense shifts. Nothing obvious, just disturbances in the spiritual current of the world. He noticed a few small villages reporting strange symbols drawn on old trees, rituals performed by young runaways, statues of an All-Mother carved in the likeness of Kaguya. He dismissed it at first. Fringe beliefs were nothing new. But over time, they grew. In a hidden glade outside the land of rain, Karasu and her followers had begun cultivating a unique tree. Dark, thorny, unlike any normal flora. It pulsed with chakra, the result of years of ritual sacrifice and meditation. They called it the seed of return. Zetsu's energy, now flowing freely among his followers, was concentrated into this tree. He did not seek to awaken Kaguya again. No, this time, he would become something else. A consciousness beyond body. A shadow that lived in every living being through the tree's roots. As the tree grew, it began to connect with the Earth's natural chakra pathways. Just like the original God tree, this seed of return began absorbing ambient chakra, but subtly, so slowly, that not even the sensory types at the leaf detected it. The land dimmed. Animals grew restless. And Karasu, now in her 20s, stood before the tree each day, receiving visions. Zetsu had learned patience. He had learned quiet. The world had tried to bury him, but shadows do not die when hidden. They grow deeper. He had no need to conquer now. Instead, he would become indispensable. In time, the shinobi would seek wisdom, and they would find it in the voice of the All-Mother, in the whispers of the rooted, in the tree's deep, unending silence. And so the stage was set. In the land of fire, Naruto began to organize a quiet investigation. He sent Sai and a handful of ANBU to trace these reports of strange symbols and chakra fluctuations. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that something old, very old, was rising again. But it was already too late, because Zetsu had never needed armies. He had never needed to win a war. He just needed to become a story that people believed, a truth that people clung to when the world felt false. And slowly, the world began to listen. Naruto had never learned how to rest. Even now, years after the wars, surrounded by family and admired by the entire village, he still woke some nights with the sensation that something just out of reach was calling to him. And lately, the dreams had returned, not of Kurama or Jiraiya or even his younger self, but of something darker, a towering tree, gnarled and unnatural, whispering not with words, but with presence, and always a feeling of being watched. He dismissed the dreams at first. After all, peace had reigned for more than a decade, and the world was quieter than it had ever been. But as the reports trickled in, stories of missing children, strange symbols carved into old ruins, sudden outbursts of chakra sickness in remote regions, Naruto's unease began to grow. It wasn't just superstition. It wasn't just fear. Something was moving beneath the world again. Sai's investigations were discreet. As head of a special ANBU unit, he had seen patterns in the shadows before anyone else. He and a small team began collecting drawings from children who claimed to see the roots that talk, and compiled stories from villagers who swore that their dreams were being invaded. One tale stuck out. An old woman in the land of rivers had drawn the face of Kaguya, though she claimed never to have heard of her. Another child, barely old enough to speak, muttered a name in their sleep. Karasu. That was the first time Naruto heard it. He remembered Karasu vaguely from an incident years ago, an orphan girl involved in a border skirmish, taken in briefly by a medical team, and then vanished. Nothing suspicious at the time. But now her name appeared in multiple reports as the leader of a growing sect of rogue shinobi who never fought, never stole, and never revealed themselves, except in whispers. Meanwhile, in the Rooted's sanctuary beneath the land of rain, Karasu knelt before the tree. Her chakra had changed over the years, darker, richer, but oddly stable. Zetsu's influence flowed through her like a second heartbeat, invisible yet constant. She had grown into a powerful Sensor 9, capable of feeling shifts in the world's chakra field from hundreds of miles away. That morning, she had felt something, an awakening of old eyes. Someone important had begun to notice. "Is it time?" she asked the tree aloud, her voice calm but heavy. Zetsu responded, not with words, but with feeling, a subtle pull in her spine, a warmth that crept up her arms. Not yet. Not until the tree's roots reached the heart of the shinobi world. Not until they tasted the chakra of the great clans, Uchiha, Hyuga, Uzumaki. Until then, she was to remain a rumor, a ghost, so the rooted moved silently. Like a fungus spreading underground, they embedded themselves in small towns, taking roles as doctors, monks, teachers. They taught philosophy, not jutsu. They gave comfort to the broken. They asked questions instead of giving answers. And in doing so, they gained trust. Zetsu had long understood that loyalty earned through kindness was far stronger than loyalty bought with fear. In the hidden leaf, Naruto stood before the stone faces of the Hokage monument, reflecting on his journey. He thought of the old threats: Pain, Madara, Kaguya, and how visible they had been, how clearly they had drawn battle lines. But this felt different. This new threat, if it was a threat at all, was like mist, shifting, intangible, and worst of all, it made people feel comforted, not terrified. Sasuke returned from a mission not long after, silent as ever, but perceptive. He had been scouting ruins in the land of sound when he encountered a shrine deep in the jungle. At its center was a statue of a woman with a third eye, her arms stretched out in sorrowful welcome. It was Kaguya, or at least an image of her softened into something motherly. Etched beneath it were words that chilled even Sasuke's blood. All pain ends when we return to the root. Sasuke didn't speak of it immediately. Instead, he stared at the shrine for hours, searching for signs of genjutsu, traps, deception. But there were none. The shrine had been built with care, patience, and above all, belief. The rooted weren't raising armies. They were growing a religion. Back underground, Zetsu reveled in his slow return. This time, he was not using a single vessel. Karasu was his high priestess, yes, but the rooted were his limbs. And soon, he would awaken not in a single body, but as a web of consciousness, a network of minds, all attuned to him, all connected by the seed of return. The tree continued to grow. Its roots reached miles into the earth, drawing in chakra from the land itself. The ambient energy of nature, once pure and undisturbed, began to change in areas where the tree's influence extended. Animals became silent. The skies dulled. The very soil felt tired. And yet, the people who lived near these regions spoke of peace, of serene dreams, and feelings of being watched over. It was insidious. Zetsu had turned the natural world into his lullaby. Naruto called a council meeting. The 5 Kage gathered in secret, their faces older now, but their resolve no weaker. He shared his concerns, showed them drawings, symbols, reports. Some, like the Mizukage, dismissed it as superstition, but others saw what he saw: the pattern, the slow encroachment. Something was forming beneath the surface. But how do you fight belief? That was the question no one could answer. In the quiet of night, Naruto stood on his balcony, staring into the stars. He thought of the old root division, the one Danzo had led in secret, manipulating the leaf from the shadows. That darkness had nearly cost the village everything. And now, here was a new root, not born from secrecy and weaponry, but from empathy and ideology. Yet the feeling it gave him was the same. He summoned Kurama's chakra out of instinct, only to be met by silence. For a moment, it felt like the world had dulled, like even the nine tails, sealed within him, had quieted in unease. And in the wind, Naruto swore he heard a whisper, not in his ear, but in his bone. Come home to the root. Sasuke wandered alone now, tracing the soft outlines of myths whispered in stone and shadow. He moved without a sound through the dense forests bordering the land of sound, guided by faint chakra trails and half-buried rumors. There was something ancient here, something waiting. It wasn't just that the old laboratories of Orochimaru had been stripped clean, or that the foundations of forgotten temples bore newly etched symbols. It was the feeling that someone was retracing steps long abandoned. Zetsu's presence, once parasitic and desperate, now felt deliberate, methodical. Sasuke could sense it not as a single being, but as a presence diffused like mist across the land, seeping into thoughts, shaping ideologies. He found another shrine, this one smaller than the last, hidden beneath a collapsed cliffside. There was no statue here, only a stone basin filled with black water. It reflected nothing, and carved into the rock above it were words in an unknown script that even his Sharingan struggled to decipher. But the message was clear in its intent. The root gives, the root sees, the root remembers. He reached for the water, and the moment his fingers touched its surface, a vision overtook him, brief, overwhelming, and ancient. A battlefield, but not one he recognized. Tens of thousands stood beneath a dark sky, their chakra linked, their eyes empty. A tree stood at the center, larger than the one Kaguya had emerged from, pulsing, alive. Then it was gone. Sasuke gasped, heart pounding. It wasn't just a vision. It was a memory, not his own, but implanted, embedded like a seed. The question clawed at him. Whose memory was it? He knew where he had to go next, the ruins of the Otsutsuki shrine, deep in the land of snow. A place few had dared visit since the war. If anyone had left traces of the rooted's origin, it would be there. Meanwhile, Karasu sat in silence within the tree's hollow chamber, her eyes closed, sensing the slow movement of her followers across the land. They were not soldiers. They were gardeners, planting the seeds of a new faith, nurturing the disillusioned, the grieving, the forgotten. And it was working. Across distant regions, entire villages had begun to adopt the rooted's teachings, not as a cult, but as a way of life. Forgiveness through detachment, strength through surrender, peace through unity with the source. She opened her eyes, In the darkness before her, a form began to take shape, not fully corporeal, but unmistakable. Zetsu, not the half-white, half-black creature she had known from the texts, but something more subtle now. A ripple in the air, a pulse in the roots beneath her feet. His voice was not a whisper anymore. It was a feeling in her chest, like a second heartbeat that spoke. The next phase is near. You are ready, Karasu nodded, and with one hand, she touched the bark of the tree, channeling chakra into it. Far away, in lands untouched by war, saplings bloomed, black-stemmed, red-veined, small, and silent. But they pulsed faintly with chakra, connected to something far below. They weren't weapons. They were antennas. Zetsu was creating a network, not for communication, but for influence. A subtle reshaping of the world's chakra pathways. Not all at once, just a tilt, just enough. In the hidden leaf, Naruto gathered the few shinobi he trusted, with truths too dangerous for the council. Shikamaru, Sakura, Konohamaru. They listened quietly as Naruto laid out the patterns, the visions, the evidence. Shikamaru, ever the strategist, frowned deeply. "This isn't a war we can fight with kunai," he muttered. "This is an idea, a system of belief. If you cut it down, you make it stronger." Sakura's eyes narrowed. "Then we find the source, not the followers, the root of the rooted." But even as she said it, the phrase felt recursive, like a trap. The source wasn't just Karasu, and it wasn't just Zetsu. It was the part of people that wanted to believe, wanted to be told they could let go of pain, of memory, of guilt. Zetsu hadn't just survived. He had adapted. The vision was clearer now than ever before. He didn't want another war. He didn't want the world to burn. He wanted it to sleep, to return to the womb of chakra from which it had sprung. No more conflict, no more individuality, no more grief. He wasn't preaching hatred. He was offering oblivion wrapped in peace. Sasuke reached the shrine just as snow began to fall. The wind howled through the cracked stone pillars, and yet the silence beneath it felt alive. He activated his Rinnegan, sensing the ancient chakra embedded in the ruins. He reached deep, not with his hands, but with his mind. And he saw them, visions of the first disciples, the ones who had served Kaguya, not as soldiers, but as dreamers. Those who believed in her plan to merge all life into one stream of energy. It had never been about power. It had always been about return. The Otsutsuki, the God Tree, infinite Tsukuyomi. They were all manifestations of the same idea. Dissolve the self, escape pain. Zetsu hadn't changed. He had simply evolved from a parasite to a prophet. Sasuke stood in the snow, eyes closed, thinking not of Kaguya or Zetsu, but of Naruto, of how his old friend had always carried the world's pain with open arms. What would happen if Naruto ever believed, even for a moment, that this was the right path? That peace could be achieved not through struggle, but surrender. That was the danger. Not Zetsu's power, his truth. And somewhere, beneath miles of earth, the roots listened. They stretched. They remembered. And they waited. Snow continued to fall over the ruins of the shrine, melting gently on Sasuke's cloak as he stood in stillness. He had faced Godza and monsters, walked the path of vengeance and redemption, and seen truth through the lens of war. But this was something different. Zetsu wasn't building a weapon, but a belief. And belief, once rooted, was harder to unearth than any jutsu. As he turned from the ruins, the vision still echoed in his mind. The disciples of Kaguya offering themselves to the tree, faces serene, as if slipping into the warmth of a long dream. It wasn't death they sought, but reunion, a peace so deep it smothered thought itself. Sasuke could feel the quiet tug of that idea, seductive in its stillness. But he had known real peace, too. Earned peace, won through pain and choice. And he could never forget what was lost when choice was erased. Back in the hidden leaf, Naruto stood atop the Hokage monument, looking down at the lights of his village. They flickered like stars on earth, soft and alive. And yet, even here, there were whispers. A wandering monk had passed through weeks ago, speaking not of gods or battles, but of the rooted path. He offered no doctrine, just a question. Would you give up your suffering if it meant giving up yourself? Some had laughed. Others had listened. Naruto's thoughts were heavy. This was not a sharper of force, but of memory, of loneliness. And there were many in the world who carried heavy hearts. If the rooted offered a way to let go of all that weight, how many would choose to stay behind? He turned as Sakura arrived beside him, her breath misting in the cold night air. "We got a report," she said quietly. "A small village near the land of rivers. No violence, no demands, just silence." Everyone left their homes, walked out to a field at the edge of the forest, and sat down, waiting. "Waiting for what?" Naruto asked. She hesitated. They said the earth would open, that the root was calling them back. A cold wind swept past them, but it wasn't the chill that made Naruto's skin crawl. It was the memory of what had once been. The infinite Tsukuyomi, the illusion of perfect peace. And now it was happening again. Without jutsu. Without force, just a quiet idea blooming in the soil of grief. Far away, Karasu knelt in a clearing surrounded by her followers. The moon cast pale light across the grass, illuminating faces of all ages, shinobi, civilians, wanderers. She did not command them. She simply spoke. "We are not broken," she said softly. "We are not alone. We are seeds, waiting to return to the root. Zetsu's presence pulsed faintly beneath the earth, not a being anymore, but a system, a network. He no longer needed to speak aloud. Karasu carried his message, shaped by her own experience, colored by her own pain. That was his true evolution. He didn't need obedience. He needed resonance. And Karasu resonated with countless others, not because she preached power, but because she understood the ache of the world. In the days that followed, more reports reached Konoha. Villages slowly withdrawing from trade. Shinobi abandoning missions to meditate in the woods. Scrolls written in strange glyphs circulating among travelers, always speaking of stillness, of return. No one claimed authorship. No one took credit. And that made it harder. Shikamaru, pacing inside the war room, ran his hands through his hair. "This is like fighting fog," he muttered. "There's no enemy, no front line. It's just dissolving. Institutions, loyalties, identities, everything we fought to rebuild after the war." Konohamaru nodded. "But it's not fear that's driving people. It's peace. That's what makes it dangerous." Naruto looked down at the map, marked now with dozens of silent zones, places where the rooted had taken hold. "Then we remind them," he said, "why we choose to stay awake, why we carry pain." "But what if they don't want to?" Sakura asked. Naruto didn't answer. Elsewhere, deep underground, beneath the roots of the great tree, Karasu had cultivated in secret. Zetsu slumbered, or something close to it. His form had lost all semblance of what it once was. No longer half white or half black, no longer humanoid. He was root and soil and silence. A node of memory, a seed of intention buried in the body of the earth. He dreamed, not with images, but with sensation. The warmth of unity, the ache of loneliness, the endless loop of history. And in those dreams, he found satisfaction. Not because the world was bending to his will, but because it was leaning toward inevitability. He had learned from failure, from Madara, from Kaguya, even from Obito. You couldn't force the world to accept a dream. You had to let them desire it themselves. Karasu returned to the base, her footsteps slow, deliberate. She approached the tree and placed both hands on its bark, feeling it pulse faintly beneath her palms. Not a god, not a tool, just a reminder that everything living began as something small, quiet, and buried. The rooted didn't seek to conquer. They sought to return. Return to the place before names, before wounds, before choice. And the world, tired and fractured, was beginning to listen. The wind whispered through the forests of the land of fire, carrying with it something deeper than sound. A hum, a frequency only the most sensitive could feel. It wasn't chakra. It wasn't jutsu. It was something older, something patient. The rooted were no longer rumors or distant pilgrims. They had become a presence, like the slow growth of moss on stone, silent, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Naruto stood at the border of a small settlement, now empty. Doors hung open, teacups sat cooling on tables, and not a single soul remained. Only a circle of shoes left in the town square, all pointed outward. They had walked, it seemed, into the forest beyond, and none had returned. A shinobi team had followed the trail once. Only one came back, eyes hollow, whispering that they had heard the earth speak. She could no longer wield jutsu. Her chakra network had gone quiet, like a river redirected. Tsunade, called back from retirement, had examined her in silence. "It's like she let go," she said. "Not physically, spiritually." Zetsu had never needed an army. He was patient. And through Karasu, through the soil and the trees, his reach was not like fire, but like water, seeping, curling, making its way into the cracks of the world. Deep beneath the land of earth, Onoki's grandson, Kurotsuchi, led an investigation into strange rock formations discovered in an abandoned mine shaft. What they found stunned them. Ancient roots fossilized into the stone, shaped in patterns that resembled faces. Not carved, grown. Each bore a peaceful expression, as if sculpted from memory. And at the center, an orb of pitch-black crystal pulsed faintly, its rhythm matching the heartbeat of those who approached. Scholars from Suna, medics from Kiri, even priests from remote monasteries gathered to observe. Theories bloomed like weeds. Some believed it was an ancient seal. Others claimed it was a cocoon, growing something inside. But none could identify the chakra. It felt wrong and familiar, alien and nostalgic, like it had always been there, under the skin of the world. Karasu herself visited the site days later. She said nothing. She simply knelt before the orb, placed her palm upon it, and whispered. The orb pulsed once, then dimmed. "It's not alive," she said softly. "It remembers being alive. It remembers all of us." Back in Konoha, the elders convened. Not since the Akatsuki had the balance of the shinobi world felt so fragile. But this was no organization with goals to intercept. It was an ideology growing in the soil, in silence. Sai, once of root, understood better than most. "We trained to erase ourselves," he said quietly. "But this is the opposite. They're not being erased. They're being absorbed." Sasuke, ever watchful, left again, this time to the ruins of the Valley of the End. It was a place where gods had clashed, where fate had split into flame and shadow. He had seen truth here once, standing across from Naruto, with the world on their shoulders. Now he saw only stillness. At the base of the statue of Hashirama, vines grew in a perfect spiral, twisting upward like a prayer. In the center of the pattern was a sigil he hadn't seen before, an eye with no pupil, closed, not Sharingan, not Rinnegan, but something that had never needed to open in the first place. From that place, Sasuke could feel it. A presence not watching, but listening. The land itself had memory, and Zetsu, even in deathless slumber, was guiding it gently toward communion. The shinobi world had always fought over control, of nations, of chakra, of destiny. But now, the battlefield was internal. The question no longer was, what do you fight for? But what do you surrender to? Karasu, now considered a sage among her followers, traveled between temples, not with guards, but with gardeners. Every place she visited, she planted a seed, literally and metaphorically. Trees grew faster near her, but not unnaturally. They simply bloomed as if comforted by her voice, and her words carried no demands, only acceptance. "You are tired," she would say. "Let the world hold you for once. You do not need to be the story anymore. You can be the soil." Even some shinobi began to falter. Anko, once hard and cynical, found herself sitting among the rooted in a forest clearing one day, listening to the sound of wind in leaves. She didn't join them, not yet, but she stayed longer than she meant to, and for the first time in years, she dreamed of her childhood without pain. The Hokage Council was divided. Some called for immediate suppression, detain the rooted, destroy the trees, root out Karasu. But Naruto hesitated. "What if we destroy the cure while fighting the sickness?" he asked. "What if this isn't invasion, but evolution?" Kakashi, silent until then, finally spoke. "That's exactly how Zetsu would want you to think." Because Zetsu had never cared for speed. He had lived for thousands of years. He could wait thousands more. The rooted were not enemies in the traditional sense. They were echoes of pain, gathering in stillness, pulling the world toward a new kind of conclusion, one where the story ended not in war, but in reunion. And beneath it all, Zetsu slept, not dead, not alive, just waiting like a seed, like a thought, like a truth no one wanted to admit, that perhaps peace had always been something we remembered, not something we created. Rain drifted down over Omegakura, the droplets falling like quiet thoughts from a sky too heavy to speak. Once the epicenter of war, rebellion, and godlike ambition, the village was now oddly serene, not empty, not destroyed, simply still. Buildings once riddled with bullet holes had been covered in moss. Rusted pipes glistened not with oil, but with dew. And from the tallest tower, once Pain's citadel, Karasu gazed out over the landscape with eyes full of mourning and patience. She was not alone anymore. The rooted had begun to gather in places that once bore the weight of tragedy. Omegakure, the forest of death, the site of the Fourth Great War. Places soaked in chakra, soaked in sorrow. These were no longer just battlefields. They were gardens in progress, not in the traditional sense, but gardens of stillness, where people came to sit, breathe, and remember without violence. Karasu called it the reclamation. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't even organized. People simply arrived, stayed, and slowly changed. They were shinobi, civilians, wanderers, orphans. Some had seen battle. Others had only heard of it in stories. But they all came with something inside them they didn't have the words for. A tiredness, a searching, and the reclamation gave them no answers, only silence, and a place to let their roots grow. Yet outside these zones of calm, the world churned. Alliances strained. The five cage met once again, and for the first time in years, their discussions did not revolve around trade or diplomacy, but ideology. The threat was not external. It was philosophical. Kazekage Gara spoke softly, as he always had. "They are not attacking us," he said. "They're inviting us to stop." Chojuro, the quiet Mizukage, looked down at his hands. What if they're right? What if this is the answer we never tried? But the Raikage slammed his fist onto the table. We tried peace. We tried cooperation. This is submission. This is forgetting who we are. And that, at the core, was what made Zetsu's legacy different. It didn't demand blood. It demanded identity. The rooted asked a single question. What if you let go of everything you thought made you strong? In Konoha, Naruto visited a temple that had once been a weapons depot. It had been overtaken by vines, turned into a sanctuary by rooted travelers. No priests, no doctrines, just a single stone at the center of the room, engraved with a spiral and a phrase, "Rest is not weakness." He stood there, hand on the stone, remembering Jiraiya, remembering Minato, remembering a world that had taught him that moving forward was the only way to survive. But Zetsu's whisper came not as an enemy. It came as a lullaby. You've earned your rest. Let the next story begin. Sasuke, too, had changed. He no longer chased, no longer wandered. He watched, observed. He stood at the edge of a quiet lake where a rooted circle had gathered, sitting in meditation. None of them looked up. They didn't need to. He had once been a ghost moving through vengeance, but now he saw in them something unfamiliar. Not apathy, not peace, but a surrender to something he didn't understand. It made him restless. It made him remember Kaguya, Madara, and Black Zetsu. The manipulation, the rewriting of history. He met with Kakashi in the Hokage archives one night, well past midnight. "This isn't just philosophy," Sasuke said. "It's design. This was planted." Kakashi closed a dusty scroll. "I know. What do we do?" Kakashi stared at the flickering candle between them. "We ask ourselves if we're living in a story, or if we've already become part of the roots. Because the world, slowly and subtly, was bending, not in policy, not in politics, but in memory. A shinobi from the hidden cloud recalled fighting in the war. But when she tried to tell the story, the details blurred. Names slipped away. time felt foggy. It was as if the land itself was letting go of the idea of violence, erasing it like sand in water. In small villages, chakra signatures began to fade. Not violently, not painfully. People simply awoke one day, feeling quiet, emptied, still alive, still whole, but no longer carrying the weight of power. Medics could not explain it. Seals didn't detect it. But chakra was receding, leaving like a tide. And yet, those affected didn't resist. They described it like unburdening a heavy backpack they'd forgotten they were wearing. They moved slower, spoke softer, slept longer, but never cried. Meanwhile, Karasu continued walking. She never stayed long, only long enough to speak a single sentence in every place she visited. The serpent no longer coils. It becomes the earth. It was then that the shinobi nations began to agree. Zetsu was not dead. Not in any way that mattered. Perhaps his body was gone, or sealed, or crumbled beneath the mountain where Naruto had once fought Kaguya. But something had persisted. Not a ghost, not even a will, but a pattern, a suggestion. One that moved not through war, but through invitation. One that could not be fought with force, only denied. And denial required clarity. Clarity that fewer and fewer people possessed. Even children had begun to draw trees that whispered. Even their games changed, no longer about ninja battles or jutsu contests, but about sitting in circles and listening to the wind. When asked why, one child said, "The forest wants to remember itself." And the forest was spreading. From the ruins of Uzushio to the sand-blasted dunes of Suna. From the cracked mountains of Kumo to the far islands of Kiri, the same symbol began to appear. A spiral, enclosed within 3 roots. Not drawn, not carved, grown. In stone, in bark, in the veins of leaves. The world was becoming quieter. And in that silence, Zetsu was not heard. He was felt, not like a god, not like a villain, but like a truth beneath the surface, one that had waited 1,000 years and could wait 1,000 more. The world did not end. It simply drifted. Time continued, though clocks felt less urgent. The missions grew fewer. The shinobi academies still stood, but their teachings softened. Children still learned about chakra, about taijutsu, genjutsu, history. But there was something new in the air, something wordless. A sense that they were learning about a dream slowly waking up, rather than a life charging forward. The 5 great nations no longer held summits. They exchanged letters now, written by hand, delivered by foot or bird, rather than jutsu. The urgency that had once defined diplomacy had faded. Even conflict, when it emerged, sparked less like fire and more like wind in the trees, rustling, but never consuming. And deep beneath the surface, where the old roots still twisted, Zetsu no longer plotted. He no longer whispered. He didn't need to. His story had stopped being a story. It had become soil. In Konoha, Naruto stood in the training fields, where he once screamed with exhaustion, where Sakura and Sasuke bled and broke beside him. The trees had grown taller, shrouding the sky in green. Konohamaru walked beside him now, older, his face lined with questions. "Do you ever feel," he said, "like we're forgetting the edge?" Naruto smiled softly, his hand brushing the bark of a tree. "The edge never went away. It just stopped needing to cut. But if we stop preparing, then maybe we stop expecting war." Elsewhere, Karasu returned to the Valley of the End. But the statues were gone, not destroyed, transformed. What had once been two towering icons of power, Madara and Hashirama, frozen in combat, had been overtaken. Moss clung to the stone arms. Ivy spiraled down the chests. Time had worn away the faces. But most notably, trees had begun to grow from the cracks, roots pulling at the figures, not maliciously, but with insistence. The figures no longer reached toward each other in battle. Their outlines blurred, softened, almost as if they were bowing to the earth. Karasu sat at the river's edge, where once so much had been lost. She opened a scroll, not to fight, not to summon, but to write. A single line. "Even gods rest in the shade." She closed the scroll and let the water carry it downstream. In the land of wind, the desert had changed. Gaara stood at the top of a sandstone cliff, watching something once thought impossible. Patches of green, oases that had grown not from rainfall, but from silence. The rooted had come here too, meditating without shade, baking in the heat, unmoving. And somehow the land had responded, not dramatically, but with permission, as if the earth itself had longed for pause. Kankuro once asked his brother, "What happens when we forget how to fight?" And Gaara replied, "Maybe we remember how to live." Zetsu had never raised a new army. He had never burned villages or taken power by force. That was not the legacy he left behind. He had been buried in ambition, hatred, and history. But his root, his deepest root, had always been patience. And what lingered of him now moved not through fear, but through letting go. Not obedience, not subjugation, just stillness. And that, in the end, proved more contagious than war. The older generation watched it with uneasy hearts. Tsunade, retired and weathered, sat at a balcony and drank tea that never quite tasted strong enough. "They don't understand the price," she said one evening to Shizune. "No?" Shizune replied, watching a group of young shinobi play in the street below. "They don't. And maybe they shouldn't have to." In the land of iron, samurai put away their blades, not out of surrender, but out of irrelevance. There were no wars to police, no shinobi to monitor, and the last remaining warrior schools slowly emptied. One by one, the swords were mounted not for quick draw, but as symbols of memory. And memory itself began to change. The stories of Madara and Hashirama, of the 9 Tails and the Great Wars still existed, but they were no longer taught as warnings. They were told like fables, quiet myths around fire pits, passed down like lullabies. The names were remembered, but the fear that once clung to them had fallen away. Even the Sage of 6 Paths had become something else. Not a god, not a founder, just a man who tried. And in that softening, the final transformation began. Not of nations, not of politics, but of nature. The places that once screamed with chakra began to hum with something more ancient. The air in those regions thickened, not darkly, but densely. Trees bent slightly toward certain stones. Water pooled around forgotten ruins. Spirals appeared in frost, in bark, in the arrangements of fallen leaves. Not created, grown. And in one such place, deep beyond the reach of maps, a child was born to a rooted couple. He did not cry. He did not wail. He opened his eyes and stared at the sky for a long time before taking his first breath. They named him Muji. It meant without characters, not a symbol, not a word, just presence. And as he grew, he never showed affinity for jutsu. His chakra remained dormant, but his dreams were filled with trees. And one day, when he touched the ground with both hands, a sprout bloomed beneath his fingers, not from control, from trust. It was then that the elders began to speak in hushed voices, not of Zetsu, not of war, but of a new chakra, not wielded, but welcomed, not summoned, but allowed. A chakra that moved like roots, slowly, beneath notice, shaping the world not with destruction, but with inevitability. The story of Zetsu had never been about domination. It had been about remembering that the earth does not scream to be heard. It grows. And now, the earth remembered itself. Across the continent, wind whispered through branches. Rivers curled like serpents around sleeping stones. And every so often, someone would feel a breath of something older than language, a pulse, a presence, not from above, but from below. The story did not end. It simply settled. Like loam, like sleep, like the deep breath the world had waited 1,000 years to exhale. And in that breath, the legacy of Zetsu finally, quietly, became home.